Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we're answering the question, what is a battleship? I'm not sure how we got 650 videos into our YouTube channel and have not answered this question because it's a fairly common one that myself and my coworkers get asked here at the museum. Visitors to the museum ask something along the lines of, well, what makes the ship a battleship? Or maybe even more commonly, how do modern battleships compare? So my answer is, well, the Navy never built any battleships after the Iowa class. And people are like, what do you mean? There's still battleships in service today. What does the Navy use? So part of the issue with this question seems to be that people use the words warship and battleship interchangeably. I see it written a lot, and I hear it said a lot on the museum too. So Battleship New Jersey, we're specifically referring to a type of ship, a battleship, not a general term for which the word is warship, not battleship. So battleships, the loosest sense, are bigger than cruisers. They are the largest surface combatants in the Navy. They often feature heavy armor, and they have the largest guns mounted. Real simple to define that. End of video, 2 minutes, wrap it up. No, I never talk that short about stuff. So let's talk about some of the parameters into which battleships fall. There are some maximums and some minimums here. So the first ships to be called battleships and that actually be their designation and not just a slang term would be the steam-powered, steel-hulled, armored, turreted warships right before the turn of the 19th century. So ships prior to that, ironclads, feature iron armor as opposed to steel. They're still steam-driven. Some of them have turrets, but they're not quite to battleships yet. Definitely in the same family tree, definitely a direct forebearer, but not quite yet. The term battleship, of course, was a slang term that dates all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars when you're talking about the ships of the line. Another word for ship of the line, which functionally was the battleship of its day. They're doing the same job just with wood and solid shot and sails. Another term for a ship of the line was a line of battleship. Ships of the line form the line of battle, so you could call them a line of battleship. And then that gets shortened to just battleship. And we see that word pop up occasionally in older sources, but those aren't really the first official battleships. So right around the 1880s, you start to see steel introduced in the construction of ships. Turrets have already been used, shell-firing guns are already in use, steam power is being used. And typically the auxiliary sails that some of the ships during this time period had are out of the way. And these ships tend to be more ocean-going than their monitor predecessors. I won't say that they're fully ocean-going, and there are certainly still some that fall into the coastal defense category that are more in line with a battleship than they are with an old monitor. But this is where we see the line change from ironclad to battleship, and the term battleship to actually be used to describe the specific type of vessel, as opposed to cruisers, which are smaller, and destroyers, which are smaller still, that are also independently developing during this time. So the smallest of these early battleships seems to be about 8,000 tons, although 10,000 tons seems to be the closer low end. And when the Washington Naval Treaty comes around, they classify cruisers as being 10,000 tons and below, and battleships being gunships larger than that. So 10,000 tons is a good estimate for the low end. The largest battleships displaced between 50 and 60,000 tons as built, and there were some designs for 70 and 80,000 ton ships. I'm using standard displacement here, not full load. Battleships get up to be pretty high. They're not quite as large as a modern supercarrier, but they get up to that on the upper end. The smallest battleships seem to have about 10-inch guns as their main battery. And usually 10, 11-inch, 12-inch is the extreme low end. I'm trying to think of any dreadnoughts with smaller than 11-inch guns. There are, of course, some relatively modern battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, that have 11-inch guns. And the largest guns ever put on these ships seem to be 18.1 inches on the Yamato, and there are some designs for around that caliber, or maybe even a little bit bigger. There's a 20-inch gun battle cruiser under design in Great Britain during World War I, HMS Incomparable, and there are probably some other designs out there that fall right within that 20-inch window. But 18-inch, about the biggest that was ever built. 11, 12-inch on the lower end. There were a couple of 10-inch armed second-class battleships, but that's really where you draw the line. And cruisers tend to cap out at 8 or 9.2-inch guns, or some get 11-inch guns like the pocket battleships, or 10-inch guns like the American Tennessee class armored cruisers. So there is a little bit of bleed over here, but by the time the Tennessees have 10-inch guns, all the battleships are 12 and 14-inch guns. So they're always a step above. The battleships themselves fall into several categories. The earliest battleships are now referred to as pre-dreadnoughts, battleships which predate HMS Dreadnought. So these are the ships that fall into that 1880 to about 1910 time frame. There were a couple of these pre-dreadnoughts which were commissioned after HMS Dreadnought, but they all tended to be on the drawing board prior to that point. Pre-dreadnoughts typically have two twin turrets, one forward and one aft. There are exceptions to this. There are ships that just have a single turret. There were a handful of ships. Some of the early German pre-dreadnoughts had 3 turrets, but they tend to just have the 2 in their main battery. And then they have a really, really mixed secondary and tertiary battery. So if early American battleships had 13-inch guns, 4 of them, they then tended to have 8 8-inch guns, and then a set number of 6-inch guns and 5-inch guns, and then a bunch of smaller stuff for defense against torpedo boats. And this is very common of pre-dreadnoughts. They tended to have 6, 7, or 8-inch secondary guns, 9.2 in some cases at the end of their careers, and then a bunch of other sizes below that. HMS Dreadnought comes out, and they really cement the idea of there will be one main caliber gun, and there will be a secondary caliber gun, and then there might be some anti-aircraft guns thrown on top of that. And so this next generation of battleships, they're still battleships, but their subclass would be the Dreadnought type battleships, or primarily the World War I era designs. They tend to have 11 or 12-inch main battery guns, and then they'll grow up to 13.5 or 14-inch guns. They tend to still have twin turrets, although a couple of triple-turreted ships are designed during this period. They're still all steam-powered, mostly coal, but we're starting to see a transition to oil at this time. The armor plate, the true battleships tend to have about a foot of armor plating, proof against their own shells at most common battle ranges, whereas battle cruisers, another similar design, similar size, but focusing on speed at the expense of armor, are slightly different. So battle cruisers during this period tend to be longer, roughly the same weight, the same caliber gun, but almost always one turret fewer than their dreadnought counterparts. Typically, countries building battle cruisers build a class of battleships and a class of battle cruiser in the same year that have a lot of interchangeable parts. And so the battle cruiser always comes in with one fewer turret or fewer barrels per turret, depending on what the case is. So slightly less guns, but the same size. Much thinner armor, but much higher speed. Some countries will also use other things to define their battle cruisers. German battle cruisers tend to have 4 propellers while their battleships have 3. British battle cruisers tend to have 1 fewer deck in the hull than their battleships. But these are kind of arbitrary, and things get a little bit muddy at certain points, especially when a ship is designed to be one thing, and then during the design and construction process, more stuff is thrown onto it, and so it evolves beyond that. Dreadnoughts and a subclass called Super Dreadnoughts are around during World War I. The Super Dreadnoughts just have much larger displacements, slightly larger guns. They tend to jump to 15 and 16-inch guns, and therefore more armor. And then eventually, the Washington Naval Treaty stops battleship construction, so there is pretty much a 20-year window where nothing's being built. And then when battleship construction resumes again, this new class is known as either the Treaty Battleship or the Fast Battleship. Treaty Battleship, because nominally they're all built to the specifications of the Washington Naval Treaty, 35,000 tons. So battleships have grown about 3.5 times since the older pre-dreadnoughts. They're limited to 16-inch main guns, although many still have 11, 13, 14, or 15-inch guns, depending on what that country has when they're building their ship. They tend to have more speed and slightly less effective armor. And you tend to see a lot more triple and even some quadruple turrets show up at this point. They're all oil-fired and they're all steam-powered. Treaty battleships is not always the proper term to describe them all, because while they're all designed and built under the Washington Treaty, some of them follow the rules and many of them do not. So Bismarck technically is a treaty battleship, but she's almost 40% heavier than other treaty battleships, no matter what Hitler was telling the world. However, even though she's got all that extra weight, she still is about as effective as any other treaty battleship. 8 15-inch guns. She's not going to be outgunning anyone. Everybody else has something comparable. Her armor was pretty good at close range, but not very good at long range, so no better or worse than what anyone else had. Her speed was right in the same ballpark as other treaty battleships, which tend to be about 27 knots on the low end and 30, 32 knots on the upper end. The Iowas are the only battleships actually completed under the escalator clause, where they're allowed to grow to 45,000 tons standard displacement. So they're still technically treaty battleships, but probably fast battleship is the proper term to use here, because all of these battleships built post the Washington Naval Treaty fall into the fast category. There is also a slang term that exists during this time period, pocket battleships, to describe ships known by their own country as armored ships, but really are just heavy cruisers with above average guns. So those are not actual battleships. But again, that's just a slang term. That's not actually what those ships are supposed to be called. So to go back to the original question, how does this compare to a modern battleship? There is nothing comparable. Modern ships do not have heavy guns. Battleships had the biggest guns. Modern ships do not have armor plate. Besides guns, armor is the other thing that defines a battleship. So there's nothing comparable. Battleships were designed to fight with other surface warships, and there hasn't been a surface battle of any size since 1944. Is there going to be one in the future? There could be, but it seems unlikely at this point. So submarines come the closest as doing the job of what battleships do, control the sea and destroy enemy warships. The other job that battleships develop later on in their career is shore bombardment, supporting amphibious operations. And some ships can sling missiles at shore targets, but they aren't armed to the extent that battleships are. And amphibious operations may well be a thing of the past. So you can't really say that there's anything in the modern Navy that compares to a battleship. And these are all grown from other classes. Cruisers are direct descendants from destroyers. We stopped the cruiser lineage and then renamed some destroyers cruisers. And destroyers are direct descendants from destroyers and torpedo boats. And frigates and smaller vessels are direct descendants from the destroyer escorts and corvette classes. So there's nothing really that fits into battleships. Aircraft carriers, in being the queens of the fleet, the capital ships of the fleet, are the only things that come relatively close. But again, they're doing something completely different than battleships. And so the big difference here is a battleship is a very, very visible national symbol. When you send that to somebody's port, they know that you care about their business. And you can do this with near impunity, because what can sink a battleship? And once it's gotten into your port, what can you do to stop it from turning its guns on you if it wants? Aircraft carriers just don't operate like this. They can send aircraft hundreds of miles to engage targets, but unless you see that little speck in the sky that is an aircraft, you don't actually see much in the way of force projection. An aircraft carrier isn't going to sail into an enemy port and sit there and make anybody tremble. And it doesn't do any good in a friendly port. It only does good hundreds of miles out to sea where you can't see it. Likewise, submarines. They may be really effective at destroying ships, but they don't actually project power well. There's some fear that, oh, there could be one out there, who knows, but does that make a good deterrent to an enemy? Not quite in the same way that Roosevelt could send his fleet of pre-dreadnoughts around to stop conflict in South America, or that the British Grand Fleet can sit in the North Sea and prevent the German Navy from sortying, or that an Iowa-class battleship can go into the Strait of Taiwan or Beirut Harbor, or whatever the case may be, and project power. So what is your personal definition for a battleship? Let us know in the comment section down below. The names of ships, of types of ships, tend to be reused over the years. So frigates could have dealt with a sailing ship, and they now mean a modern anti-submarine escort usually. Do you think that the terms battleship or dreadnought, etc., will ever be reused for future types of ships? And what do you think those will look like? Also, let me know that down in the comment section. Finally, I went through and talked about the rough classifications of battleships in this video. If you would like to see an even more in-depth one where we go through generation by generation, for example, what's a first, second, or third generation pre-dreadnought look like versus a first, second, or third generation dreadnought, let me know in the comment section down below. Libby thinks that that's going to be boring. That's the sort of stuff that I love to classify ships by. So let me know if you're interested in that too. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourself. If you'd like to support our channel, there's a link in the description below so you can donate. There's also liking, sharing, and subscribing, which supports us by letting other people know that we exist. That way more people find out about our museum and what we're doing. Thanks for watching.